For most forms of contract, one of the crucial elements is understanding when and how the contract mechanism comes to an end, whether that's under a final account called such or something similar. So where does the payment obligation end? Under a JCT, a FIDIC or an ICE style contract, actually they're quite well defined, and it uses the words, here is the final account and there are specific consequences following a final account submission and a final determination by whoever the third party might be, project manager, engineer or architect. The mechanism under the NEC is not the same, and you almost just sort of run out of interim applications, which to someone who's not used to the NEC process seems a little bit odd. And I'm often asked, why isn't there a final account process, a proper final account process with an absolute determination at the end, rather than this sort of last interim application at the end of the defects period? I find that, as a lawyer, quite a challenging question to answer, and I can understand why a lot of lawyers would immediately sharpen their pen and look to be drafting in additional clauses to give that clarification at the end of the project, which for a lot of employers is absolutely vital to understand that they can put a line underneath the project and it's finished. I think the lack of the final account causes a number of issues across the areas of expertise that each of you have got. So let me start with Ian from a pure cost point of view. Why do you think the NEC doesn't have that process, and do you think it's missing something?
Well, I think again the issue relates in some ways to the main options you're using. Because if it's an option A, it's a fixed price activity schedule, it should be relatively easy to draw a line under the costs when all the activities are complete. The only issue will be any compensations that are maybe still being debated or haven't been agreed. But then again, they'd stop a final account being closed out under other forms as well, potentially. So option A and even option B to an extent, it's not such an issue. I think it can be more of an issue under C, D and E, where you have the defined cost. But again, you've got a problem with you have a definitive cut-off date. Some costs could flow into the contractor beyond that date, which are actual genuine costs incurred on the project. So it's difficult to determine when you would have that cut-off point. Having said that, I think there will be some benefit in having some way of bringing it to a conclusion so that both parties, both employer and contractor, knew where they stood.
John, just taking it from a more project management point of view, one of the fundamentals of the NEC is that it's very process driven and all about ensuring that good project management is implemented on site. Surely not having that cut-off date makes that more difficult.
Yeah, I mean, I think where the panel would be coming from, if you put their visionary goggles on, is that as visionaries, they're also idealists. Yeah, depending on your perspective, they're starry-eyed idealists or they're visionaries who change the industry. Where they were coming from was, if you're operating the contract correctly, compensation events, etc., should be wrapped up as you go along, and actually giving people an extra year normally until the defects date to wrap it up is quite long enough. So there isn't a need for that. But I absolutely take on board Ian's point about actually people want to know it's dead, I can move on. I don't have a fear that 6 years from now someone's going to claim against me in some way, shape or form.
Yeah, I think nowhere is that clear, and I know Ian mentioned compensation events and how that can impact it, but I think nowhere is it more clear than in compensation events. And probably when you look at compensation events, it's not the direct cost element, it's the time related and the time cost related element which is most difficult to close out. And if you haven't got that definitive process at the end, it becomes very, very difficult. So I'm sure Ewan, what's your experience of how do these things actually get closed out?
Well, it comes perhaps to John's point about idealism. If you follow the contract, it works. And you get to the end of the project and everything has been dealt with. So much so that under Clause 65, when you implement compensation events, you live by the sword and you die by the sword. So if your estimate or forecast of, or the assessment of the delay turns out to be different, you can't revise it. And that's what I think the contract is trying to achieve. It's trying to get certainty such that when you do get to the end of the project, everything has been resolved. And if there have been inaccuracies along the way, then you live with them.
I think Just going back to one of the options, which I think is Ian said, and I think quite rightly, is the problem areas. It's around the options C, D, E, the cost reimbursable side, and where the bits of cost appear late, or even worse, where cost is being disallowed late, and that's what's driving the final account. And how do you deal with that situation? Is there a better mechanism? Should there be a way of stopping new claims coming through, either positive money claims or negative disallowance claims?
Well, there is a cut-off around compensation events, and they're going to be issued to a certain point in time. So there is a limit around that. Disallowed costs, again, for me, they should be being dealt with proactively as the job progresses and not a retrospective exercise. So again, I think it comes back a little bit, as John was saying, to the intent of what they're trying to achieve with the contract, and the idea that if people operate it properly, it will naturally draw itself to a conclusion. Because if you've been following the procedures, the processes, even in respect of the payments, that should bring it to a conclusion in a relatively timely fashion. I think with a lot of other contract forms, they have a final account. That itself can be extended and extended and extended because things aren't being agreed, other issues are still impacting on the job. So I'm not sure having a final account would give it a very, would be a magic one to bring everything to a conclusion at a certain point in time. If the contractor was still aware of costs to come through, they may not be able to agree that final account. So, there's a bit of a balance needed around what you can achieve through a final account process.
I think summarising that, it's for me anyway, it's a point of distinction between the NEC and other forms of contract. They don't have this clear cut-off at the end. But that being said, if you're operating the mechanisms in the contract properly, probably you don't need that mechanism because it's all been wrapped up and dealt with as you've gone along. That being said, you need to think quite carefully at the outset of your project whether actually a definitive end date is significantly important or significantly important enough to require additional terms to be drafted in to give you that clean break and to ensure that everyone knows where they stand at the end of the project. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.